The station was a meat market, and the storm was the butcher. Snow howled outside, clawing at the walls, but inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and judgment. Men stood with their hands in their pockets, their eyes scanning the rows of women like they were picking out livestock. Each time the conductor called a name, a man would step forward, grunt, and say something like, "She'll do," or "That one's mine." Then another woman would be gone, dragged out into the white hell, and the room would get a little smaller, a little colder. Elsie sat on the hard bench, hands clenched so tight in her lap, her knuckles were white. She was the last one. Always the last one. She was pretty, with hair as dark as a raven's wing and eyes the color of a summer sky, but she had a secret, a flaw, a reason for the whispers that followed her everywhere. She shifted to ease the ache in her leg, and the movement was all it took. A slight hitch, a barely there stagger. The limp. The men who had been watching her looked away. Their interest vanished, replaced by a cold pity that was worse than disgust. A woman with a limp was a broken tool on a homestead. A burden. The whispers started up again, sharp as needles. Pretty face, but what good is it? God doesn't hand out burdens for no reason. She heard Caleb Foster's low chuckle. He was a man who'd once courted her, before he saw her stumble. Now his pity was a weapon he used to make himself feel strong. Shame burned under her skin, hot and familiar. She felt like the last unwanted thing on earth, an object to be discarded. She closed her eyes and prayed for the snow to just bury the station, to bury her, to make the judging eyes go away forever. The conductor cleared his throat, his eyes flicking to her, then away. The room was almost empty now. She was the final piece of inventory. Just as he was about to call her name, to offer her up to any man who might take her out of charity, the station door didn't just open. It exploded inward. A wall of snow and wind roared into the room, and standing in the middle of it was a man. No, not a man. A giant. He was massive, tall enough that he had to stoop to get through the doorframe. His hair was long and white as the blizzard itself, falling over shoulders that were broad as an ox yoke, and he wore no shirt. In the middle of a killer storm, his chest was bare, covered only in a web of thick, ancient scars that looked like rivers carved into stone. His eyes were black holes, and they burned with a fire that had nothing to do with warmth. The station fell dead silent. The wind howled, but it was nothing compared to the silence inside that room. Men who had been sneering seconds before now looked small, their hands inching toward their belts. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. The giant's gaze swept the room, slow and deliberate, passing over everyone, dismissing them. And then his eyes found Elsie, and they stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Everyone else saw a broken woman, but the way he looked at her, it wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity. It was something else entirely. It was recognition, as if he'd been looking for her his entire life. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the snow that had blown in. Each step seemed to shake the floorboards. He walked past the remaining men, past the pot-bellied stove, and didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He smelled of pine and cold air and something wild she couldn't name. Snow melted in his white hair, running in rivulets down his scarred chest. He just looked at her, his burning eyes seeing right through the shame, right through the fear, all the way down to the person she'd forgotten she was. For a long moment that stretched into eternity, he said nothing. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then his voice came out, low and rough, like stones grinding together in a deep river. "You're coming with me." The words weren't a question. They were a statement, a fact. The air crackled. Gasps echoed around the room. Caleb Foster muttered, "Better she die alone," but he didn't dare say it loud enough for the giant to hear. The giant held out a hand. It was huge, calloused, and covered in scars just like his chest. Elsie stared at it, her mind screaming. This was madness. This was a nightmare. This man was a stranger, a savage in the eyes of everyone she knew. Going with him was a death sentence. But staying here, under their pitying eyes, listening to their whispers for the rest of her life, wasn't that a death sentence too? His hand didn't move. It was steady, patient. He wasn't forcing her. He was offering her an escape. The storm raged outside. The whispers cut at her from behind. And this impossible man stood before her, offering a hand that promised, what? Ruin? Deliverance? She didn't know. But she knew one thing. He was the only person in that room who looked at her and didn't see something broken. And in that moment, that was enough. The wind hit her like a physical blow the second they stepped outside. The world was gone, erased by a swirling vortex of white. The station, the town, everything vanished. The only thing that was real was the giant's hand, wrapped firmly around her wrist. It wasn't cruel, but it was absolute. There was no letting go. She stumbled through snowdrifts that came up to her knees, her limp making every step a fresh agony. The cold was a living thing, sinking its teeth into her bones. But the giant moved like the storm was nothing. He became a wall, his enormous body shielding her from the worst of the wind. Steam rose from his bare skin as if he had a furnace burning inside him. She tried to ask where they were going, but the wind snatched the words from her mouth and tore them away. All she could do was follow, putting one foot in front of the other, trusting the unyielding grip on her wrist. It felt like they walked for hours, or maybe days. Time had no meaning in the heart of the blizzard. Just the crunch of his boots, the scream of the wind, and the thudding of her own terrified heart. Just when she thought her legs would give out, that she would collapse into the snow and let it take her, a dark shape loomed out of the white chaos. A cabin. It was small, hunkered down against a hillside as if it were hiding from the storm. He shouldered the door open and pulled her inside. Warmth hit her face so suddenly it felt like a slap. A fire was already blazing in a stone hearth, its golden light dancing on rough-hewn walls. Thick furs were piled on the floor and on a simple wooden bed frame. The air smelled of wood smoke and cedar. It was safe. Her knees buckled. She would have fallen if he hadn't caught her, guiding her to a stool by the fire. She started shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. He took a heavy fur from the bed, it smelled of pine and the wild outdoors, and draped it over her shoulders. The weight was immense, but it was a comforting weight, and the warmth began to seep into her frozen limbs. She finally dared to look up at him. In the firelight, his scars seemed less terrifying, more like a story written on his skin. He moved to the hearth, poured steaming water from a kettle into a clay cup, and handed it to her. Her fingers were so numb she could barely hold it, but she managed to take a sip. The heat spread through her chest, chasing away the ice. She was his prisoner. She had to be. But he wasn't acting like a captor. He moved with a strange, quiet grace, setting out bread, dried meat, and a bowl of beans on a small table. He gestured for her to eat. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing noise in the quiet cabin. Cheeks flushing, she ate, slowly at first, then with a hunger that surprised her. The silence in the cabin was as thick as the furs on the floor. Outside, the storm shrieked like a banshee, but inside, there was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of his steady breathing. He sat on a bench opposite her, just watching, not with hunger or malice, just watching. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. "Why me?" He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, his scarred hands resting on his knees. The firelight played across his weathered face, making the lines around his eyes seem even deeper. After a long moment, he looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to pierce right through her. "I know what it is to be cast aside," he said, his voice a low rumble. "To walk alone. You carry the same shadow." Her heart skipped a beat. No one had ever spoken of her shame so plainly. They either ignored it or mocked it. No one had ever claimed to share it. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. He saw her. He actually saw her. Hours passed. The storm slowly began to lose its fury. She sat by the fire, her body warm, but her mind racing. Who was this man? What did he want from her? She was terrified, but for the first time in years, the sharpest edges of her shame had been blunted. Here, in this cabin, with this scarred stranger, she wasn't just the girl with the limp. She stood up and moved to the small window, rubbing a clear patch on the frosted glass. Her reflection stared back, a pale, frightened woman wrapped in a giant's furs. Behind her she could see his reflection too, a mountain of a man sitting by the fire, unmoving. "They laughed at me," she whispered, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Everyone in that town. They said no man would ever want me, that I was a burden." He rose from his bench, his movements silent and fluid. He came to stand behind her, his presence so immense it felt like the whole cabin shrank. She expected him to say something, to offer some hollow comfort. He didn't. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to one knee. Before she could react, his large, warm hand gently closed around her ankle, right over the spot where the bone had healed wrong. His touch was firm, steady. It sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. He looked up at her, his eyes level with hers. His voice, when it came, was softer than the wind, yet it carried the weight of the mountain he resembled. "Strong," he said, "not broken." A sob broke from her throat. Tears she had held back for years finally escaped, blurring the firelight into a shimmering haze. No one had ever called her strong. They saw the limp, the weakness, the flaw. But this man, this stranger, he touched the source of her deepest shame and called it strength. His hand stayed on her ankle a moment longer, the warmth of his skin seeping through the cloth of her dress. Then he drew it back and stood up. She felt the loss of his touch like a sudden chill. She turned to face him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Why do you say that?" she asked, her voice choked with tears. He held her gaze, and in the deep, dark pools of his eyes, she saw a reflection of herself she had never seen before. It wasn't the broken girl from the station. It was someone else. Someone fierce. Someone whole. "Because I see," he said, and the simple certainty in his voice hit her with the force of a physical blow. She trembled, caught in a whirlwind of hope and disbelief. She wanted to trust him, to believe in this impossible new vision of herself, but years of mockery were a heavy cloak to cast off. As she stood there, torn between a lifetime of shame and a single moment of grace, the wind suddenly slammed against the cabin door, rattling it in its frame. It sounded like the world was trying to break in, to drag her back to who she used to be. And she suddenly knew, with terrifying clarity, that the real storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. Word travels fast in a small town, especially a nasty word. By the time the blizzard broke and a weak sun peeked through the clouds, the story of Elsie and the savage was on everyone's lips. It was told in the general store, whispered over fences, and laughed about in the saloon. "Went with him. Can you believe it?" Martha Consincade clucked, her face pinched with self-righteous disgust. An old Apache, half naked in a storm. The girls lost her mind. "More like she was desperate," Caleb Foster added, leaning against the blacksmith's forge, a cruel smirk on his face. "Guess even a savage will do when no decent man wants you." The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly. It echoed across the snow-covered town, a poison that seeped into the very air. Elsie didn't hear the words, but she felt them. She felt them in the way Grey Wolf, he had finally told her his name, looked at her, his eyes searching, as if waiting for the town's poison to take root in her. But inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. He didn't speak much, but his silence was a comfort, not a judgment. He taught her things. He showed her how to read the clouds, how to split wood with a single clean stroke. When her hand trembled on the axe handle, he would place his large, scarred hands over hers, guiding the blow. The solid warmth of him, the quiet strength, was a language all its own. Sometimes, when she stumbled on the uneven floorboards, his arm would shoot out to steady her, his grip firm on her elbow. In those moments, their eyes would meet, and a silent current would pass between them, something more powerful than words. But the town was always there, waiting. A few days later, they needed flour, and the journey back into that world of whispers felt like walking into a cage of wolves. The moment they stepped onto the main street, the staring began. Women pulled their children away. Men stopped talking and just watched, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and contempt. And Caleb was there, of course, waiting for his chance. He swaggered out of the saloon, blocking their path. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look what the storm dragged in. Found yourself a charity case, old man?" Grey Wolf didn't react. He stood as still as a mountain, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But Elsie flinched. The word, charity, was a slap. Her cheeks burned. She wanted to turn, to run, to hide back in the safety of the cabin. But then she felt Grey Wolf's presence beside her, solid and unyielding. She gripped the walking staff he had carved for her, its wood smooth and strong beneath her fingers. She took a breath. The air was cold and sharp. She looked Caleb Foster dead in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the street. "He is more of a man than you will ever be." A collective gasp went through the small crowd that had gathered. Caleb's face darkened, a flush of angry red creeping up his neck. "What did you say? You crippled little—" He never finished the sentence. Grey Wolf moved. It wasn't fast, but it was with a terrifying certainty. He took one step forward, placing himself between Elsie and Caleb. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't make a threat. He just stood there. But the sheer power radiating from him, the promise of violence held in perfect stillness, was more frightening than any weapon. Caleb Foster, for all his bluster, was a coward. He took a step back, then another, his eyes wide. He looked around for support, but the other men were suddenly very interested in the toes of their boots. Defeated, he spat on the ground and stormed back into the saloon. The spell was broken. People started moving again, muttering to themselves. But something had changed. Elsie had spoken back, and the giant had defended her without throwing a single punch. The walk back to the cabin was silent. When they got inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around them, but Elsie was still trembling. The confrontation had taken everything she had. She sank onto the bench by the hearth, her strength gone. "They'll never stop," she whispered, her voice raw. "To them, I will always be nothing. A broken thing he took pity on." The old shame was creeping back in, a cold, familiar snake coiling in her gut. Grey Wolf watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't decipher. Then he crossed the room and did something that stunned her into silence. He knelt before her. For the second time, this giant of a man who could break Caleb Foster with a single look was on his knees in front of her. He reached out, not for her ankle this time, but for her hand. He gently pried her fingers open from the fist she had made and held her hand in both of his. "They see a cracked pot," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They do not see that the cracks are where the light gets in." He looked from her face down to her leg, and then back again. "They see a limp. I see a survivor. They call you a burden. I call you—" He paused, his gaze so intense it felt like it was stripping away every lie she had ever been told about herself. Mine. The word hit her with the force of a tidal wave. It wasn't a word of ownership, of possession, the way the men in the station had used it. The way he said it, it was a word of belonging, of sanctuary. It was a shield against the whole world. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of a dam breaking, of years of pain and loneliness washing away. She looked at this impossible man, with his scarred chest and his quiet strength, and she realized she wasn't his prisoner. She was his. And in that moment, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was also his. But just as this earth-shattering realization settled in her heart, a sound from outside ripped through the fragile peace. It wasn't the wind this time. It was shouting. Angry voices, dozens of them, and the flickering, dancing light of torches began to bleed through the cracks in the cabin walls. Caleb Foster had not gone home to lick his wounds. He had gone to gather a mob. The shouting grew louder, a chorus of hate and fear. "Come out, savage! Give us the girl! We'll burn you out!" Elsie's blood ran cold. She scrambled to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. The hillside was alive with torches, their flames casting demonic, dancing shadows on the snow. At the head of the mob stood Caleb Foster, his face twisted with rage and cheap whiskey courage. Beside him, Martha Consincade held a lantern high, her thin lips pulled back in a righteous snarl. Even the sheriff was there, looking uneasy, but doing nothing to stop them. "They're going to kill you," Elsie whispered, turning to Grey Wolf, her voice choked with terror. "It's my fault. Please, just give me to them. Don't fight them." Grey Wolf looked from her terrified face to the door, where the pounding of fists and axe handles had begun. His expression was calm, but a dangerous fire was burning in his eyes, a fire that had been banked until now. He put a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. "A fire built on lies burns out quickly," he murmured. Then, before she could protest, he strode to the door and threw it wide open. A blast of cold air and smoke filled the cabin. The mob fell silent, momentarily stunned by his sudden appearance. He stood in the doorway, framed by the firelight from within, his bare, scarred chest seeming to glow. He was a mythic figure, a spirit of the mountain, and for a second, the angry farmers and shopkeepers looked like frightened children. Caleb found his voice first. "There he is! He's got her trapped in there! We've come to set her free!" A roar of approval went up from the crowd. "She's not your prisoner!" Elsie cried, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She pushed past Grey Wolf and stood on the threshold, her body trembling but her voice clear. The torchlight illuminated her face, showing the tracks of tears but also a new, defiant light in her eyes. "I am not his prisoner," she repeated, her voice ringing out across the snow. "You people, you left me to rot. You whispered about me. You laughed at me. You treated me like I was less than human because of this." She stamped her bad leg, the pain a sharp reminder of a lifetime of humiliation. "Not one of you offered me a kind word. Not one of you saw anything but a burden. You threw me away." A guilty murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of them lowered their torches, unable to meet her gaze. "This man," she said, turning and placing a hand on Grey Wolf's arm. "This man you call a savage. He saw me. He saw strength where you saw weakness. He gave me shelter when you offered me scorn. He chose me." Caleb sneered, his bravado returning. "He chose you? He's a heathen who took what no one else wanted. You're just a fool, too desperate to see the truth." "The truth?" Elsie's voice rose, laced with an anger that had been simmering for years. "You want to talk about truth, Caleb Foster? The truth is, you stopped courting me the day you saw me stumble because you were a coward. You were afraid of what people would say. The truth is, you are weaker than any woman in this town." The crowd was dead silent now. The accusation hung in the frozen air. Undeniable. Caleb's face went from red to ghostly white. He had been exposed, his petty cruelty laid bare for all to see. He lunged forward, his face a mask of pure fury. "You—" Grey Wolf moved. He didn't step toward Caleb. He simply placed himself in front of Elsie, a silent, immovable wall. His hand rested on her shoulder, a simple gesture of protection that was more powerful than any weapon. It said, "She is with me. You will not touch her." Caleb stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the giant before him, at the unwavering certainty in his eyes, and all the fight went out of him. The whiskey courage, the mob mentality, it all evaporated, leaving him small and pathetic in the torchlight. With a curse, he turned and shoved his way back through the crowd, his shame a palpable thing. One by one, the others began to follow. They shuffled away, their torches lowered, the angry shouts replaced by embarrassed muttering. Soon, only the sheriff remained. He looked at Elsie, then at Grey Wolf, and tipped his hat. "Seems to me," he said, his voice gruff with regret, "this town owes you both an apology." Then he too turned and walked away into the darkness. The night was quiet again, the only sound the gentle hiss of falling snow. Elsie's legs finally gave out, and she sank to her knees in the doorway. The adrenaline fled, leaving her weak and shaking. Grey Wolf bent down and, with effortless strength, lifted her into his arms. He carried her back inside and set her down on the furs by the fire. He knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. "I stood up to them," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. He looked deep into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw the corners of his mouth lift in the barest hint of a smile. It transformed his harsh, weathered face, revealing a warmth she had only glimpsed before. "I told you," he said, his voice a soft rumble, strong, not broken. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the man who had walked out of a storm and into her life, who had faced down a mob for her, who had seen the strength in her that she could never see in herself. And she knew that the whispers and the scorn of the town no longer mattered. They were nothing but echoes from a life that was no longer hers. She leaned forward, her hands trembling, and gently touched the scar that ran from his temple down his cheek. He didn't flinch. He just closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. The storm outside had passed. The mob was gone. But a new storm was breaking inside the little cabin, not one of wind and snow, but of something far more powerful, something that had been building since the moment their eyes first met across that crowded, judgmental room. It was the beginning of a love as wild and untamed as the land itself. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm settled over their lives. The town left them alone, the story of the failed mob becoming a source of communal shame they preferred not to discuss. Elsie found that when she walked, she no longer tried to hide her limp. Grey Wolf had given her a gift more precious than shelter. He had given her back her own dignity. She learned the stories of his scars. Some were from battles with men, others from battles with beasts. Each one was a testament to a life lived without fear. And in turn, she told him the story of her own scar, the fall from the horse, the years of whispered insults, the crushing weight of being seen as incomplete. He listened without speaking, his dark eyes holding her, absorbing her pain, until it no longer seemed to belong to her alone. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he reached into a leather pouch and pulled something out. It was a necklace, not of bone like the one he wore, but of smooth, polished river stones, each one a different shade of gray and blue, strung on a simple leather cord. "My mother made this," he said, his voice soft. "She said it held the strength of the river, which always finds its way, no matter the obstacle." He held it out to her. Elsie's breath caught in her throat. This was not just a gift. It was a piece of his history, of his soul. Her hands trembled as she took it. He helped her fasten it around her neck, his calloused fingers brushing against her skin, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The stones were cool against her collarbone, a comforting weight. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I have nothing to give you," she whispered. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "You have given me peace," he said. "I have been a man of war and solitude for a long time. You have quieted the storm inside me." In that moment, all the fear, all the uncertainty that had lingered in the corners of her heart finally dissolved. She saw him not as a savior or a protector, but as a man, as beautifully scarred and broken and strong as she was. He had not rescued her. They had rescued each other. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. When she opened them again, she knew what she wanted. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. His lips were firm, chapped by the wind, but the kiss was gentle, hesitant at first, and then deepening with a passion that had been simmering between them since that first impossible moment in the station. It was a kiss that spoke of shared pain and newfound joy, of lonely pasts and a future they would build together. It was the sealing of a bond forged in a blizzard and tempered by fire. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, their breath mingling in the warm air of the cabin. The fire crackled, the wind sighed gently around the eaves, and for the first time in her life, Elsie felt completely, utterly whole. She was not the broken girl from the station. She was a survivor. She was strong. She was loved, and she was home. Elsie and Grey Wolf showed that the deepest scars are often invisible, and that true strength isn't about being perfect. It's about finding someone who sees the beauty in your flaws. What do you think is more powerful, the judgment of a crowd or the love of a single person? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of courage and unlikely love, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales that prove that even after the fiercest storm, a new day can dawn.